What would happen if the woman everyone pitied was the one quietly holding an entire duchy together? The Duke believed his wife would endure anything in silence. His neglect, his humiliation, even the slow theft of the life she deserved. But what he never understood was that Seraphina was never powerless. She was simply patient. And when she finally stopped protecting the empire built in his name, every crack he had never noticed began to split wide open. He thought she would leave in tears. Instead, she stayed and took everything from him piece by piece without ever raising her voice. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, emotional stories like this one. Now let's begin the story. The great hall of Vale House glowed as if it had been built for light. Crystal chandeliers spilled gold across polished stone. A string quartet played with disciplined sweetness notes, measured, elegant, almost indifferent. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves, the sound of glasses touching like tiny bells. Everything in the room said security, the kind of wealth that expected to be admired without ever being questioned. At the center of it all stood Duke Alaric Vale, a man who wore attention the way other men wore coats. He held his wine as if it were part of the room's architecture, an ornament that belonged in the hand of someone born to stand precisely where he was standing. His smile was effortless, designed for proximity, calibrated to give every person within its radius the pleasant illusion that they were being seen. Lady Vivian Arclight stood at his right side, close enough to share his warmth, far enough to keep her own. She angled her body just so, letting the candlelight catch the clean line of her throat and the pale shimmer of her gown. People noticed. Vivienne always made sure they did. She laughed softly at something one of the officers said, then leaned in toward Alaric with the intimacy of someone who had already claimed a future. "You truly make them believe nothing is ever beyond your control," she murmured, lips barely moving. Alaric's gaze stayed on the circle of guests around him. His voice was light, confident, almost amused by the simplicity of the world, because it usually isn't. Across the hall near a tall window, where the glass reflected a duplicate chandelier, Lady Seraphina Vale stood half in shadow. The light touched only part of her face, turning the rest into something soft and unremarked. Her dress was a quiet color, an elegant restraint that would have been admired if anyone had been looking for it. No one was. She held her glass without drinking, listening to the room, the way she listened to paperwork, attentive, patient, absorbing the rhythm. Two women stood close by, their conversation shaped like politeness, but sharpened by curiosity. "Is that her?" one asked in a whisper that was meant to be discreet. "The Duchess," the other replied, glancing without turning fully. "Yes. Poor thing. She never seems present." "She isn't," the second woman said, and there was a soft, satisfied certainty in it. "At least she doesn't cause trouble. She'll never fight back." Seraphina heard every word. She did not turn. She did not tighten her jaw. She did not let the glass tremble in her hand. She simply lifted it, took one small sip, and lowered it again with the same precision she used for everything that mattered, making it look to anyone who happened to glance her way as though the words belonged to a conversation in another room. They always did. In the eyes of Vale society, Seraphina was a title attached to a marriage. A duchess by law, a footnote by function. She was known for her quietness, her lack of spectacle, her habit of disappearing from the room before anyone could decide whether they should speak to her. She moved through the hall slowly and exactly, never brushing against silk, never forcing someone to step aside. She did not draw the eye because she did not ask for it, and because the world loved to confuse silence with emptiness. A footman passed, tray balanced on his palm. He dipped his head as Seraphina neared. She gave him a brief nod on a 1 second of steady attention that made the young man straighten, as if his existence had been acknowledged by the only person in the room who noticed the strain in his shoulders. On the other side of the hall, Alaric was recounting a recent maneuver with the ease of a man speaking about himself. "I told them the river was a distraction," he said, voice carrying just enough to invite admiration without sounding like a boast. They were watching the wrong bank. A guest laughed, delighted. "You always see what the rest of us cannot, Your Grace." Seraphina watched not Alaric, but the way the crowd leaned in, hungry to be near certainty, hungry to borrow some of it for themselves. Vivian touched Alaric's sleeve, as if she had the right to anchor him. "You should speak of these things more," she said sweetly. "Not everyone has your clarity." Alaric smiled. "Perhaps because not everyone is capable of it." Someone near Seraphina, a gentleman with a mild face and a better-than-average sense of manners, turned and nodded politely. "My lady," he said, "do you take part in these matters?" Seraphina met his eyes, calm and unreadable. "No, I only ensure things happen on time." The gentleman gave a small laugh, relieved to have his assumption confirmed. "Ah, of course." Seraphina did not explain. She did not say, "I wrote the schedule you're living under." She did not say, "I corrected the errors that would have embarrassed him in front of you." She did not say, "Timing is strategy, and you have no idea how much depends on it." She simply held her glass and let the room believe whatever it needed to believe to stay comfortable. Dinner that night was arranged like a theater set. The table ran long beneath the candelabra's flame, reflected in the silver cutlery and the glossy polish of dark wood. The Duke sat at the head, as he always did. Vivian was placed at his right, close enough to be mistaken for permanence. Seraphina sat at the far end, framed by distance and the gentle insult of being physically present but socially irrelevant. The space between them was not large. It only felt like it was. Alaric began speaking before the soup had cooled, drawn into performance by the slightest invitation. Someone asked an interested question about the shifting priorities along the southern road. "We must adjust the flow of resources," Alaric said smoothly. "If we do not, you will see imbalance within 3 months." A guest leaned forward, impressed. "You saw that coming." Alaric tapped his glass lightly, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. There were signs, if one knows how to read them. Vivian smiled around the table. "That is why not everyone sits where you do." At the far end, Seraphina cut her food into small pieces, set her knife down exactly, and said nothing. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. Her movements were unshowy and deliberate, like someone who understood the value of control and refused to waste it on spectacle. Vivian's gaze flicked toward her, and her voice lowered into something meant to be intimate, but carried just far enough. "There are people," Vivian said, "who exist best when they do not try to become noticeable." A few polite laughs drifted down the table. No one looked directly at Seraphina. It was easier that way. Alaric heard the remark. He did not defend his wife. His expression barely shifted. If anything, the corner of his mouth rose, as if Vivian had entertained him. Seraphina lifted her glass, took one sip, set it down. Not fast, not slow, exact. Alaric continued, sentence after sentence delivered with admirable clarity. The guests nodded and praised the strength of his thinking. Their faces shone with the pleasure of being in a room with someone they believed could protect them from uncertainty. And while he spoke, a different image sat quietly beneath the surface of the moment. A folded sheet of paper on a desk upstairs. Ink-dry lines, neat handwriting, a few careful crossings out. Logic sharpened and reassembled. The shape of a strategy rendered comprehensible to someone who preferred to be admired for instinct rather than intelligence. Seraphina had sat alone in the side study earlier that day. The room had smelled of candle wax and old paper. Her fingers had been faintly stained with ink, not a flaw, but a sign of use. She had read the reports. She had read the letters. She had read the subtext inside the subtext, the parts that men like Alaric never learned to hear because the world told them they did not need to. She had rearranged the argument, tightened the sequence, added one detail that would make the plan look inevitable rather than merely possible. She had caught a contradiction and removed it before it could humiliate him in front of the wrong audience. She had made the decision feel clean. Then she had read it once more, not for elegance but for impact, folded it neatly, and placed it on Alaric's desk without signing her name. There was no gratitude required in this marriage. There was only function. Now at dinner, Alaric spoke each line exactly as she had shaped it. The rhythm, the emphasis, the conclusion. The guests praised him for the very clarity she had given him. They were not lying. They simply did not know where it had come from. At the far end of the table, Seraphina no longer watched his face. She had heard enough. This was the arrangement. It had always been the arrangement. On ordinary days, Seraphina read the letters before they ever reached the Duke's hands. She sorted them by urgency, not by how loud they were. She removed the useless ones, flattery disguised as requests, complaints with no actionable content, invitations that served ego but drained resources. She marked what mattered. She adjusted what was careless. She redirected what was dangerous. In finances, she balanced the flows, quietly moving weight from one place to another so that nothing cracked where people could see it. The estate's books never screamed, because she never allowed them to. In personnel, she remembered everyone, who was loyal to the house and who was loyal to the idea of power, who could be trusted with silence, who would sell a secret for the price of a new coat. When Alaric made a decision that would cause trouble in 3 weeks, Seraphina corrected it in 3 minutes, leaving him the pleasant illusion that he had been right all along. It was not that Alaric was incapable of thought. He could be clever in the way charming men often are. He could improvise an explanation when he needed one. He could make people feel safe, which was a kind of power. But the intricate work, the slow, unglamorous labor of keeping a system coherent was not something he had ever trained himself to do, because he had never had to. Seraphina had done it for him, for years, not out of love, not anymore, out of the simple fact that if the house fell, she would fall inside it. But something changed the morning after the dinner. A new order arrived on her desk, a proposed adjustment to winter distribution that seemed at first glance reasonable. It had Alaric's seal on the cover letter, the confident flourish of his signature. Seraphina opened it, read once, then read it again, slower. It was wrong, not wrong in a trivial way. Wrong in the kind of way that did not explode immediately, but sat inside the structure like rot. Wrong in a way that would create a problem weeks later when the weather had hardened roads, when tempers were thin, when food became less a matter of comfort and more a matter of survival. She stared at the page longer than she usually allowed herself. She reached for her pen, and then she stopped. Her fingers held the pen. Her hand hovered over the margin where she would normally begin. But the pen did not move. There was a knock at the door. "My lady," a servant asked carefully from the hall. "This paper is meant to be delivered to His Grace." Seraphina folded the document, slid it into an envelope, sealed it as if nothing were unusual, handed it over. "Deliver it as it is," she said. The servant hesitated, a tiny instinctive pause, as if his body had recognized that the world was shifting in a way he could not name. "No amendments, my lady?" he asked, voice low. Seraphina met his eyes with a steadiness that left no space for argument. "No." The servant left. The room fell quiet. Seraphina remained seated for a few seconds, more breathing evenly, as if she had simply made a mundane, administrative choice. The only difference was that she could feel it inside herself, a door closing softly without drama. Nothing had changed in the house. And yet, for the first time, a wrong decision would go directly to the Duke without her hand correcting it. That evening, Seraphina stood alone in the corridor. The music from the hall floated up and away, muffled by distance. She looked down at her hands in the candlelight. A faint smear of ink remained along her finger, a mark that would not fully scrub out. She had used these hands to hold the house upright for years. No one had ever asked what would happen if she stopped. She barely moved her lips when she spoke, as if even the air did not deserve to hear it loudly. "They aren't wrong." A pause. "I've never fought back." Her gaze lifted. Not hard, not cold, simply no longer soft. "I've just never stopped holding everything up for him." And for the first time, she turned away from the direction of Alaric's study and chose not to return. The next morning began the way mornings always did at Vale House. The servants moved with quiet efficiency. Fires were tended, curtains drawn, trays arranged, letters carried up to the Duke's rooms on a precise schedule. Only this time there was a small difference. A report arrived late, and one envelope was missing. Seraphina's familiar marking, an unobtrusive dot of ink she sometimes used on items that required immediate attention. A private system no one else recognized as a system. Alaric opened the day's correspondence quickly, as he always did. He read fast. He did not linger. He treated paper the way he treated most things, something to be moved through, not examined. His brow furrowed slightly, not because the report was incorrect, because it was unclear. Something was absent. A connective line. A distilled conclusion. The comforting sensation of being guided. He called out sharply, "Whitaker." Roland Whitaker, the head steward, entered with the measured calm of a man who had spent decades learning what could be controlled and what could not. "My lord," Alaric tapped the page. "This section is missing." "It has never been missing." Whitaker glanced at it briefly. "That is the full report delivered this morning, my lord." A small pause tightened the air. Alaric did not ask how. He did not ask why. Pride prevented the question because the question implied dependence. He filled the gap himself with assumption, with confidence, with the kind of instinct that looked impressive when it happened to be right. He signed the order. The mistake was minor. No one noticed it immediately, but the system had shifted by 1 degree. In the side study, Seraphina sat at her desk with morning light spread across the surface like a pale sheet. 3 stacks of letters were arranged before her, each with a subtle mark, a corner fold, a ribbon, a smear of wax signals that meant something only to her. Clara Whitmore stood opposite the desk, hands folded, waiting. Clara was young enough to still feel surprise, but old enough to hide it. She had been hired for her quiet competence and kept because she learned quickly. Seraphina opened the first envelope, scanned it, and said, "This one stays until this afternoon." Clara blinked. "My lady, that report is usually sent at once. It concerns the Southern Road." Seraphina did not look up. "Not what His Grace needs to read this morning." Clara's gaze dropped to the papers again. She nodded slowly, the acceptance careful, as if she were learning the contour of a new rule. Seraphina reached for another letter. "This goes up first." Clara glanced at the seal. "But it isn't urgent." Seraphina set down her pen. Her voice remained even. "Precisely." Clara looked at her, then truly looked as if she were trying to see the shape of Seraphina's intent through the fog of years of habit. Understanding arrived quietly. The letters were rearranged not by importance, not by need, but by influence. By which ones would lead the Duke's mind in the wrong direction, without the wrongness being obvious. Upstairs, Alaric read what was placed before him. He made a decision based on incomplete context. He did so confidently, because he had always been confident. An officer questioned the direction with caution. "Are you certain of this course?" "Your Grace," Alaric answered without hesitation. "I'm always certain." In another room, Seraphina read the portion of the report that had been withheld. She knew exactly what was missing. She could see the outcome as clearly as if it had already occurred, but she did not send it up. For the first time, information was not being used to prevent a mistake. It was being used to shape one. She made one quiet decision to stop saving him, and that choice would become his downfall. If you were in her place, would you walk away or stay and take everything back? Don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most intense part of the story. The shift deepened quietly over days. Seraphina did not destroy the Duke's authority. She did not embarrass him publicly. She did not announce her rebellion or invite anyone to witness it. She simply began managing the flow of reality in a way that no longer protected him. That afternoon, she went to the finance rooms, where the air smelled faintly of dust and old leather. Elias Thornfield sat at a table covered in ledgers. His spectacles perched low on his nose. He was the kind of man who trusted numbers more than people, because numbers at least did not perform. He stood immediately when Seraphina entered. "My lady?" Seraphina set a stack of documents on the table. These expenses no longer received priority. Thornfield flipped through quickly, eyes moving with practiced speed. "But these are the accounts for events, visiting, dinners, gifts." "Image," Seraphina said, and the word cut through the list like a blade. Thornfield hesitated. His Grace usually insists those remain high. Seraphina met his gaze. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. His Grace does not read the detailed ledger. The truth landed softly, but with undeniable weight. Thornfield closed the book slowly. He did not smile. He did not look relieved. He looked as if someone had finally spoken aloud the assumption he had been forced to hold in silence. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Seraphina's answer was simple. "Stop smoothing the edges." A day later, Alaric received a financial report that had not been prettied. It contained real numbers, sharp, inconvenient, refusing to be shaped into comfort. His mouth tightened. "These figures are wrong," he said sharply. Thornfield, careful, replied, "They are accurate, my lord." Alaric stared longer than he usually allowed himself to stare at anything that challenged him. He was used to stability on paper, used to reports that bent toward his expectations, used to believing the world aligned itself because he commanded it. Now the numbers did not bend. In the corridor outside, Seraphina paused near the door. She heard the exchange. She could have stepped in. She could have softened the moment, redirected. It protected the Duke from the uncomfortable sensation of being confronted by his own lack of attention. She did not. She continued down the hall, her steps quiet, on the runner, leaving the truth to sit with him. At the same time, the household began to shift in subtler ways. Whitaker came to Seraphina more often for direction. At first it looked like routine. Then it became pattern. "My lady," he asked one morning, "do you wish the guest list for next week altered?" "Remove the last two," Seraphina replied. Whitaker's brows lifted slightly. "They are allies of Lord Cedric." Seraphina did not flinch. "And no longer essential." Whitaker nodded once. No argument, no surprise, as if he had been waiting for her to say something like that for years. Clara meanwhile adjusted the flow of correspondence without anyone needing to tell her twice. She redirected replies, changed which invitations received prompt attention, quietly controlled who gained access to the Duke's time. Thornfield began bringing reports to Seraphina first, not because she demanded it, but because he understood where decisions were truly being made now. A new system formed beneath the visible one. It was not official. It was not announced. It did not need to be. It worked. A junior servant new enough to the house to still ask questions caught Whitaker in a corridor. Why must everything pass through her grace? He asked quietly, as if afraid the walls might overhear. Whitaker looked at him with the calm of someone who had seen too many seasons to be startled by truth. "Everything always has," he said. "You simply didn't notice before." The Duke's first meaningful failure arrived not as catastrophe, but as embarrassment. Alaric signed a major order with his usual confidence. It was intended to secure a partnership with a supplier from the western provinces, an arrangement that would strengthen the Duke's standing and keep the winter routes stable. 3 days later, the partnership collapsed. Not dramatically, no shouting messenger, no scandal, simply a short, stiff letter that arrived with an unhelpful seal and a polite refusal. A resource had been assigned incorrectly. A promise had been made without necessary preparation. A detail had been missed. The consequences were not ruinous, but they were visible. In the next council meeting, Lord Benedict Hawthorne spoke with the gentle bluntness of a man who had learned that politeness was more effective than cruelty. This decision, Benedict said, tapping the letter lightly, lacked a layer of analysis. Alaric's voice cooled. "I considered it." Benedict held his gaze. "Perhaps not enough." The room did not erupt. It did not need to. Silence did the work. In the back of the chamber, Seraphina listened. She did not show expression. She had seen this outcome the moment the order landed on her desk. She had known precisely which line would break under pressure, which promise would fail, which person would feel newly empowered to doubt. She had chosen not to fix it. Either the small failures began stacking, each one too minor to be called disaster, but together creating friction where there had once been smoothness. A letter answered late. A meeting scheduled poorly. A decision made without the full context it required. A payment delayed because someone somewhere had stopped rushing to make the Duke's life easier. Alaric began reading more carefully, asking more questions, thinking longer. Tasks that had once felt effortless now demanded effort. Not because the world had grown more complicated, but because he was no longer being carried through it. One afternoon, an officer murmured privately, "Things have been slower lately." Alaric snapped, "Then you are simply failing to keep pace." But his eyes betrayed him for half a second. A flicker of uncertainty, a small crack in the performance. Vivian noticed the crack long before anyone else dared to name it. In her private sitting room, she set her glass down with more force than she intended. The sound was not loud, but it carried in the quiet. "You've been occupied lately," she said, tone light, but pointed. Alaric, standing near the fire, replied, "Minor adjustments." Vivian tilted her head. "Minor adjustments don't make you stare at documents as if they might bite you." A pause settled between them. Then she asked softly, dangerously, "Or perhaps things were never as perfect as you believed?" Alaric looked at her and did not answer. Vivian turned away, but her eyes had shifted. Suspicion, once planted in her mind, did not die easily. It grew. That night, Seraphina returned to her study. Papers lay across the desk. Letters, ledgers, personnel lists. The visible bones of a living system. She stood over them without hurry. Everything was still here. Nothing had been burned. No scandal had been manufactured. The Duke's name still carried weight in public. His title remained untouched, but something essential had changed. The system no longer belonged to him, not because she had stolen it, because it had never truly been his to begin with. She spoke the thought aloud as if doing so made it real in a way silence never could. It was never his. Then she set her pen down, not to correct, to rewrite. And in that quiet room, while the manor's grand hall slept beneath chandeliers that would blaze again tomorrow, Seraphina Vale began doing what everyone had insisted she would never do. She began to fight back without raising her voice, without leaving, without giving anyone a clean moment of drama to point at and dismiss. She fought by controlling the only thing that mattered, the way the world moved. The council chamber on the west side of Vale House had been designed to manufacture certainty. The table was long and dark, polished until it reflected candlelight, like still water. The chair at the head sat a fraction higher than the rest, not enough to be crude, just enough to remind anyone who entered where authority lived. Maps lay spread beneath the flames, borders traced in careful ink rivers, and roads turning land into something that could be measured, owned, controlled. Reports were stacked in straight lines, each one a small altar to order. It was a room made to sustain the illusion that power was a fixed thing, a weight that stayed where it was placed. Duke Alaric Vale arrived several minutes late. It was not an outrageous lateness. Not the kind that would normally draw comment, but the delay landed differently now because it fit too neatly into the recent pattern, the fraction of a second too long before decisions. The hesitation he tried to hide with arrogance, the way his confidence had started to feel like effort. The men rose as he entered, yet not as quickly as they once did. There was a slight drag to it, a stiffness that suggested they were standing because the room demanded it, not because their instincts did. Alaric pretended not to notice. Lord Benedict Hawthorne spoke first, as he had begun to do more often lately. His voice was calm, not confrontational, the tone of a man who would rather solve a problem than win a duel. "My Lord Benedict," said, hands resting on the edge of the map, "we need a decision on grain redistribution to the southern stretch. If we keep the current allocation, the 2 river counties will run short within 12 days. Alaric looked down at the report. He turned to the correct page. He even found the relevant line, but he read too quickly. Shift from the eastern stores, he said at once, as if speed could substitute for precision. Captain Julian Verne lean-weathered, the kind of officer who understood consequences in his bones, frowned. The eastern stores were reduced last month, Your Grace. A pause opened narrow and dangerous. Alaric lifted his head, and for a moment his eyes searched the table the way a man searches for an object he expected to be there. Then increased transport from the northern hill region, he said. It was not a foolish answer. It might even have worked if he had remembered what the hill region had endured after the poor harvest. Elias Thornfield, who rarely inserted himself into grain matters unless the numbers demanded it, spoke carefully. The hill region is already carrying a shortfall since the harvest fell below projection. My lord. Alaric placed one hand on the table's edge and smiled faintly. Too faint to be friendly, too controlled to be genuine. I'm speaking of temporary adjustment, he said, not a long-term reconstruction. Benedict looked down at the map again, then back up at the Duke with a gaze that was neither hostile nor indulgent. Temporary adjustment still requires accurate figures, Your Grace. The chamber went quiet. No one openly contradicted the Duke further. No one needed to. The silence did it for them, filling the space between Alaric's certainty and the reality it could no longer cover. For the first time in that room, the men around the table did not look at Alaric as if he were the only source of answers. They looked at him as if he were simply the man seated in the highest chair. When the meeting ended, Alaric did not leave. The others collected papers, murmured formalities, and drifted out in pairs. Their footsteps faded down the corridor. The door closed. Candle flames remained steady and uncaring. Alaric stood alone before the map hands behind his back. He stared at the borders as if they might rearrange themselves into something simpler if he stared long enough. In the past, decisions had arrived at his hands in a state that felt clean. Problems had been separated into layers. Data had been ordered by importance. Options had been narrowed in a way that made the right choice seem obvious. Risks had been pushed toward the edges of the page before he ever saw them. Now the papers were what they truly were, dense overlapping, filled with threads that refused to untangle themselves on command. He called out sharp against the emptiness. Whitaker, Roland Whitaker, appeared as if he had been waiting on the other side of the door, which, in truth, he often was. His posture was composed. His face gave away nothing. He carried years the way he carried trays, balanced and steady. Your Grace. Bring me the original reports from last month, Alaric ordered. All of them. Whitaker dipped his head. They are here, my lord. Alaric's jaw tightened. No, I want the full set. Whitaker's gaze lowered briefly to the stacks on the table, high, thick, untouched. That is the full set, my lord. A moment passed. It was short, barely the length of a breath, but long enough for the truth to touch Alaric's, where it could not be denied. He had never looked at the full set before. Not really. Not as a thing he had to navigate alone. He had always been shown a shaped version, one that led him step by step to a conclusion he could deliver as if it had been born in his own mind. He opened the first report. Then the second. Numbers bled into numbers. Notes stacked onto notes. A problem on one page reached into 3 other pages without announcing itself. There was no neat path in, no handrail, no distilled summary with the most dangerous variables circled in calm ink. He tried to build the logic himself to gather the strands and braid them into something coherent. But every time he grasped 1.3, others popped loose. It was like trying to walk on a floor that turned to sand beneath each step. He dropped the report back onto the table, not with violence, not with theatrical rage. Just enough force to make a candle flame tremble. For the first time in years, Alaric faced something more humiliating than any public slight. The machine that bore his name had never truly been his. He had only stood at the final stage of a process someone else had been completing in silence. Over the next 2 weeks, the small misalignments began to connect into a pattern. In finances, trouble no longer stayed politely hidden. An investment into the Western transport line stalled because approval had been delayed at the wrong moment. Suppliers requested new terms sooner than expected, no longer content to wait on promises. Reports on hospitality expenses, once rounded, softened, made to look like proof of prosperity arrived with sharp edges. Minor deficits that had always been balanced elsewhere now appeared plainly on the page, unhidden and unashamed. Thornfield brought a stack of ledgers to the Duke one morning, his voice careful. "If we do not redistribute this quarter, my lord, by early winter we will be forced to cut further." Alaric looked up, irritated, not by the numbers but by the affront of being told there was a limit. "We do not cut," he said. "We expand. Every noble in the region is watching." Thornfield, who had learned long ago to respect titles while refusing to lie to arithmetic, kept his tone even. "Expansion does not alter the total sum available, my lord." Alaric stared at him longer than was polite. It felt in a way he could not articulate, like being spoken to, as if he needed a simple calculation. Explained. That had never happened before. In military logistics, the strain showed differently, but no less clearly. Julian reported irregularities in the grain wagon's alignment with escort schedules. A protection unit arrived late because the departure timetable overlapped with another patrol in a way it never should have. Hill region stores had been misjudged in their capacity to cover deficits. Orders were not wholly wrong, but they lacked the micro-adjustments that made the difference between a system that flexed and a system that cracked. During one morning briefing, Julian said, "Controlled, but direct, Your Grace. The order on paper is workable, but it does not account for the terrain after the rain." Alaric answered sharply, "Then be flexible." Julian's eyes held on him for a second longer than comfort allowed. Then he said quietly, "Flexibility cannot replace calculation." Political relationships began to thin at the edges like fabric worn too long. 2 houses postponed dinner invitations. A letter from an old family received a reply only after the required etiquette window had passed. A proposal for cooperation came back with a polite refusal, couched as "we require further consideration," which everyone knew was a courteous way of saying "we no longer trust your stability." In corridors and waiting rooms, no one spoke bluntly. They didn't have to. The language shifted instead. "Recently, lately, it doesn't feel like it used to." And beneath all of it, a sound that did not yet qualify as collapse, but was unmistakably the beginning of stress, the faint crackle of a structure that had started to fracture where the repairs were no longer being made. One evening, Alaric entered the side study Seraphina used for reviewing papers. She was seated at the desk, candlelight low, a file open before her. Her hair was neatly arranged. Her posture was still. If anyone saw her through the door, they would have assumed she was doing something harmless and domestic. Alaric did not greet her. He did not soften his approach with ritual. He placed a report down in front of her. "Eastern stores," he said. "These figures don't match last month's projection." Seraphina glanced down, read quickly, and answered without hesitation. "Because the reserve shipments were rerouted to the southern line 3 weeks ago." Alaric frowned. "Why did I not see a note about that?" Seraphina flipped the page and pointed to a thin line of text along the bottom margin. "It's recorded." Alaric stared at the line. It was small, easily missed by someone accustomed to reading summaries rather than details. He lowered his voice as if volume might threaten his pride. "If you knew why, didn't you tell me?" Seraphina looked up. Her expression was not cruel. It was simply unmoved by his discomfort. "You didn't ask." Silence stretched. Alaric placed his hand on the edge of the desk. "You know exactly how much I'm handling." Seraphina closed the file with a soft, final sound. "Yes," she said. "And for the first time, you're handling it yourself." The sentence landed like a blade, not because it was sharp, but because it was precise. It did not accuse him of anything he could argue against. It simply named the truth. Alaric tried to pivot, as he always did, when he could feel himself being cornered. "If you saw the drift points, you could have warned me sooner." Seraphina's voice remained level. "I am doing my duties." His laugh was short and empty. "Your duties?" She met his eyes steadily. "Managing what belongs to the household. Preserving what can be preserved. Keeping things operating within a reasonable boundary." He waited almost instinctively for the familiar ending, "I will fix it for you." It never came. In the absence of that final expected line was the coldest thing she had said all evening. That same night, Alaric returned to his main study and began opening drawers he had not opened in months, pulling files from stacks he had never touched. He wasn't searching for evidence against Seraphina. In truth, he still didn't think in terms of her as an opponent. That would require admitting she had agency in a way he was only beginning to comprehend. He was searching for understanding. How had everything stayed so smooth for so long? He found old reports with faint notes in the margins. Brown ink, tidy script. Small symbols without signatures. The rearrangement of arguments. The tightening of logic. A data point added here, an assumption removed there. Tiny interventions that created large stability. He flipped through documents he remembered signing with absolute confidence. Now reading the raw versions, he realized the papers he had seen at the time could not have been the untouched originals. Someone had made them clearer, more coherent, easier to decide. Someone had made him look like the kind of man who could rule without effort. He called Clara Whitmore near midnight. She entered with controlled surprise, the expression of someone startled, but trained never to show it fully. Alaric held up a file. "Who handles these drafts before they reach me?" Clara hesitated just enough to prove she was choosing her words carefully. "It depends on the type, Your Grace." His tone tightened. "I asked who?" Clara looked down. Then she answered with the calm of someone who had survived long enough in a house built on silence to understand that truth must be delivered like medicine measured. Most of what requires a clear sequence passes through Her Grace first. Alaric went still. The statement was not new. It should have been obvious. But spoken aloud, it took on weight. "How long?" he asked, voice quieter now, as if loudness would make the answer worse. Clara lifted her eyes. "Long before I came to Vale House, Your Grace." When she left, Alaric stood alone amid the scattered proofs of a truth he had never wanted to assemble. The marginal notes. The meetings that had always ended cleanly. the decisions he had thought were instinct, the crises that had never quite managed to become crises. Nothing bore Seraphina's signature. Nothing demanded her credit. But that perfect absence, the way she had done the work without leaving her name behind, was exactly what made it undeniable. From that point onward, Alaric began looking at Seraphina differently, not with sudden tenderness, not with the warmth of a man who had found love, with something closer to fear, because he could no longer pretend she was merely the quiet background of his life. He could no longer pretend she was harmless. He began asking small questions more frequently. Has the Southern correspondence arrived? Has Lord Wynne confirmed the schedule? Where should I begin reading this? Each time Seraphina answered, accurate, brief, cooperative enough that no one could accuse her of defiance. But she stopped just before the line where saving him began. One morning he handed her a draft and said, review it. The words were simple. In Vale House, they were nearly a confession. Seraphina took it, read it, folded it, and placed it back on the desk. The second argument is weak, she said. Page 3's numbers undermine your conclusion. Alaric waited, and Seraphina looked at him. You can revise it. His silence was immediate. What unsettled him was not merely that she refused to do it for him, it was that she believed without apology that he should be capable of doing it himself. As if she were placing him back in his true position, no higher, no lower, just smaller, than the man he had pretended to be. Soon he found himself dependent on her presence in any room where decisions were made. If she sat quietly near the wall, he felt less unsteady. If she was absent, the facts seemed to separate from each other, refusing to form meaning. But dependence was not control. And the fact that he could not control her anymore began to make him panic. Vivian Arclight was the first to recognize the shift in the most social and merciless way. She noticed invitations thinning, praise cooling, Alaric's attention drifting mid-conversation as if he were wrestling with something she could not touch. One afternoon she entered her private sitting room wearing deep blue, dropped her gloves onto the table, and asked bluntly, "Must we keep pretending everything is as it was?" Alaric stood at the window. He didn't turn immediately. "If you have something to say," he replied, "say it." Vivienne's smile was small, sharp. "You used to be a place worth standing beside." Alaric turned, then eyes colder. Used to Vivienne's mouth curved slightly. "I didn't stay out of loyalty, Alaric. We both know that." 3 days later, she left Vale House. No scenes, no tears, just absence, clean and efficient, like a woman stepping away from an investment that no longer promised return. Alaric barely managed anger. Not because he didn't feel it, but because the loss he was experiencing elsewhere was far larger than the loss of Vivienne's flattering presence. After she went, the movement inside the house became clearer. Whitaker began taking instruction from Seraphina without needing to circle back to the Duke for confirmation. Thornfield sent numbers to Seraphina first, as a matter of course. Clara arranged appointments according to priorities Seraphina quietly set. No one announced the shift. No decree was read aloud. It simply happened the way real power often does, by reorientation. The larger shift arrived inside the council itself. In a corridor exchange, Benedict Hawthorne said to Whitaker in a tone as casual as if he were asking about weather, "If Her Grace has thoughts on winter allocation, I would like them before the meeting." Whitaker bowed. "I will convey it." The sentence was small. The implication was not. For the first time, a council member was no longer waiting for the Duke's clarity first. He wanted Seraphina's. Julian began bringing his most difficult technical question to her under the pretext of household verification. Each time he left, he carried what he needed. No one called it authority, because what was shifting to Seraphina did not come with a crown or an announcement. It came with outcomes. Late one night, Alaric stood alone in the empty council chamber. The map was still spread. The high-backed chair was still there. All the symbols of power remained untouched. But the symbols no longer held him up. They were just objects, silent, beautiful, meaningless, if the man among them could not move reality with his decisions. He thought back over the months how decisions had arrived nearly complete, how he had entered room spoken, a few lines, signed a few papers, and left under admiration. He thought of Seraphina at the far end of the dinner table, in corridors, in quiet rooms lit by low candles, always present, always silent, always ensuring the machine ran as if it ran on its own. And for the first time, with no one watching, he shaped the clearest sentence he had ever formed about himself. He had not lost power. He had simply realized he had never truly held it. The crisis that finally forced the truth into the open arrived in early winter. It did not come with cannon fire. It came with paper and refusals and the convergence of three problems that struck within 48 hours. A Western supplier cut off credit, refusing to renew terms. Two major landholders requested suspension of support, citing loss of confidence in the duchy's allocation system. Lord Cedric Wynne sent a formal notice that he would not sign the Winter Trade Alliance unless Vale House could prove it could stabilize itself for 3 months. The West Council chamber opened earlier than usual. Maps covered the table. Ledgers and letters were stacked in layers. Seals and dispatch notes sat beside each other like tools and weapons. The atmosphere was no longer the polite tension of governance. It was the clear sensation of a structure standing on the edge of losing its footing. Benedict spoke first without his usual softening. If the Western line stops in 8 days, we will have to cut reserves in 4 counties. If we cut, the local lords will react. If we do not cut, the Treasury cannot purchase replacement, Julian added immediately. And if Wynne's alliance fails, winter transport must go around the Eastern Pass. We do not have enough wagons. Thornfield closed a ledger with a heavy sound. The Treasury cannot tolerate another decision made for appearances, he said. We need priorities, not pride. All eyes turned toward the head of the table. Alaric sat in his dark coat, one hand on the wood. His elegance was still there, but it had hardened. His eyes held the tension of a man forcing himself upright before others could see how unsteady he had become. He began speaking as if authority could still solve the matter by sheer presence. We will send a letter applying pressure to the West, he said, and maintain current allocation to prevent panic. As for Wynne, he paused. A short pause, barely a blink. But everyone in the room recognized the empty space because they had been seeing it more often now. Benedict asked bluntly, "Maintain allocation. With what source?" Your Grace Alaric turned toward the maps as if the question were a distraction. "We will redistribute internally." Thornfield did not avoid it this time. Redistribute from where no one filled the gap for the Duke. No one offered him a clean bridge out of the emptiness. Alaric stood, walked to the map, and pointed to the central region like a man who still believed posture could become solution. If we slow payment to the Southern Cluster direct funds, West first, then compensate by drawing from the river stores, Julian cut in rare and firm. The river stores were transferred to reinforce the northern hills last month. That order bears your seal. Alaric turned sharply. Then withdraw from the northern hills. Thornfield shook his head. If you withdraw from their wages for the transport crews at month's end, will not clear. Benedict's voice stayed calm, but it struck like a hammer. You are moving the same resources through 3 positions as if they are 3 separate sums. A thick silence fell. In the past, moments like this had always been saved by an invisible correction, someone quietly reframing, redirecting, producing a path forward. Today, there was no such intervention. Alaric looked around the table. They sat in their usual places. Their manners were intact. Their voices remained controlled. But they no longer looked at him as the only person who could return order to the world. He returned to the head of the table and placed his hand on the stacked papers. For the first time in that room, he knew with sick clarity that he had no next answer. Seraphina had been present the whole time, not as an official council member, not as a declared authority. She sat at the left end of the table, close enough to satisfy etiquette, far enough to preserve the old illusion that she was not central. She had not spoken. She had not reacted when Alaric stumbled. She had read the documents in front of her with quiet focus, as if this were simply another day of work no one ever named correctly. When the silence stretched to the point of suffocation, Seraphina placed her hand on her papers, not hard, not dramatic, just enough to draw attention. She spoke in a low, clear voice. The deficit is not in the food, she said. It is in the payment rhythm. The room stilled. Alaric looked at her. He did not stop her. Perhaps because he had nothing better to place on the table. Perhaps because some part of him understood that the only way out of this was through the one person he had spent years ignoring. Seraphina opened the first page. The Western suppliers not withdrawing because they lack product. They are withdrawing because our last 3 payments arrived late. They believe we are covering a long-term gap with short-term credit. Thornfield's head lifted immediately. Yes. Seraphina continued, eyes on the numbers. The gap is not caused by logistics. It's caused by image spending remaining high 6 weeks ago when the reserve could no longer balance it quietly. Several gazes met around the table. They realized she was not merely describing the problem. She was naming it correctly. Seraphina rose. She did not ask permission. She did not claim the room by force. She simply moved toward the map as if the map belonged to the person with the solution rather than the person with the title. She pointed to 3 locations with a wooden pencil. We do not need to save 3 fronts. Simultaneously, she said, we need to stop pretending they carry equal priority. She indicated the Western line. First, stabilize credit. Do not negotiate with pride. Pay a portion immediately from the Central Reserve in exchange for a 4-week extension. She shifted to the river counties. Second, reduce allocation temporarily in the 2 least volatile counties, but announce it as a seasonal adjustment, not an emergency cut. If you name it correctly as a cut, they will revolt. If you frame it within governance, they will accept. Then she turned to Benedict. Third, with Wynne, do not request an alliance extension. Offer him priority on the new transport line if he commits wagons for 10 weeks. He does not want to rescue us. He wants to profit from our need. Benedict studied her a long moment. He will accept. Julian stepped closer to the map. If Wynne's wagons arrive in 10 weeks, I can demote the Eastern Pass to secondary rather than primary. Thornfield opened his ledger rapidly and began calculating on the edge of the paper. He looked up and his gaze flicked briefly to Alaric, then settled on Seraphina. If we cut these specific expenses, he said, initial payment can be made within 3 days. Seraphina did not stop. She turned another page as if she had not invented anything on the spot. As if the entire structure had been built already, line by line, with contingencies prepared. If the West refuses the initial payment, we execute Plan B, temporarily collateralize spring revenue from the southern cluster. I have marked which expenses can be reduced without breaking diplomatic protocol. No one asked how long she had been preparing this. The answer was in front of them. She had always prepared everything. Only today, for the first time, she spoke it into form. When she finished, no one interrupted. The silence that followed was not mere surprise. It was the kind of silence that occurs when a room has been lit from a different direction and everyone realizes, too late, that they have been staring at shadows for years. Benedict broke it first, and he did not look at the Duke. He looked at Seraphina. "Have you accounted for the landholders' responses?" "Yes," Seraphina said. 2 will protest by letter. 1 will remain silent if invited privately before tomorrow. The 4th will accept if reassured the river line is not being abandoned. Julian asked immediately if wind demands more than wagons. "Offer priority on the spring salt route," Seraphina replied. "Not land, not tax rights, transport priority." Enough for him to feel victorious, not enough to touch the core. Thornfield exhaled in a way that sounded like relief. So the Treasury holds through winter. Throughout those questions, Alaric remained at the head of the table. No one shoved him aside. No one needed to. The axis of the room had shifted without noise. They were no longer waiting for him to explain the world to them. They were looking at the person who had quietly kept the world explainable all along. Whitaker stood by the door, his expression composed, but something in his gaze carried a quiet solemnity, not discovery, but confirmation. Not because he had learned the truth, but because the truth was finally visible among men who were accustomed to believing visibility was power. The meeting ended late. The council members left to execute the plan. No one spoke loudly. No one gossiped in the hallway. But the way they left told the whole story. They carried Seraphina's instructions. They moved with the rhythm she had set. No one asked the Duke what the next step was. When the door closed, only Alaric and Seraphina remained in the council chamber. The candles burned low. The map stayed open. Her pencil marks remained on the paper, like proof that a different hand had shaped the outcome. Alaric spoke first, his voice rougher than his appearance. "Why didn't you leave?" Seraphina did not answer immediately. She gathered her notes with calm efficiency. When she finally spoke, her voice remained even. "Do you want me to leave?" Alaric gave a short laugh without humor. "Don't do that. You know what I'm asking?" She met his gaze direct and unsoftened. "I know." Silence lingered. He stepped closer by a single pace. "You could have let this fall. You could have let me fall with it. You have every reason." "True," Seraphina said, simply. "Then why?" This was no longer the question of a duke to a wife. It was the question of a man finally seeing how much the other person held. Seraphina's answer was clean without ornament. "Because I don't need to leave to win." Alaric froze. She continued, voice steady. "If I leave, you can call it accident, betrayal, and unexpected misfortune. If I stay, you are forced to see it as it is." He clenched his hand slightly. "And what is it?" Seraphina looked around the room, at the map, at the chair, at the symbols that had elevated him. That everything you thought was yours, she said, never stood on its own without me. The next morning, the council met again to sign emergency adjustments. The room remained the same. The seating remained the same. The titles remained intact. But the sequence of the meeting had changed completely. Benedict entered first and asked Whitaker casually, "Has Her Grace arrived?" Julian placed the new logistics plan directly beside Seraphina's seat, not Alaric's. Thornfield presented an updated balance sheet aligned perfectly with Seraphina's contingencies before the Duke had spoken a word. When Seraphina entered, no one leapt to their feet with a new ritual. They did not need to invent ceremony. Their eyes turned toward her automatically. Benedict began, "If we apply Plan B alongside Wynn's contract, will the Southern Cluster exceed tolerance?" "It won't," Seraphina said, "if the letter is sent before dusk and framed as spring compensation rather than winter reduction." Julian nodded once. "Then I'll move the first convoy tonight. Thornfield said I'll lock image spending at dawn." Alaric remained at the head of the table. No one pulled him from his chair. No one needed to. This was how real power moved, not by a loud overthrow, but by people no longer waiting for your decision. That afternoon, the winter governance document was prepared for official record. By tradition, it required only the Duke's signature and the household seal. Benedict read the final version and said in a tone so polite it was almost gentle, "This should also carry confirmation from the person who structured the allocation." No one pretended to misunderstand. Alaric lifted his gaze. It swept the room and stopped on Seraphina. For a brief moment, the old Alaric flickered the man who might have refused, simply because refusal maintained illusion. But now refusal would only make him smaller. He set his pen down beside the paper without speaking. Whitaker slid the document toward Seraphina. At the bottom, beneath Duke Alaric Vale, there was a blank line. Seraphina took the pen. Her hand did not tremble. She did not pause for permission. She did not look around the room as if to confirm she was allowed to claim what had always been hers. She signed Seraphina Vale, not as a wife affirming etiquette, as the architect of stability making herself undeniable. The sound of the pen lifting from paper was small. But in that chamber it sounded like a door opening in reverse. Winter passed without disaster. Supply lines held. Wynn's alliance was secured on terms more advantageous than anyone would have expected. The landholders stopped complaining and began sending shorter, more practical letters written in the language of stability rather than accusation. The household changed. It grew quieter not from oppression, but from efficiency. Less money was poured into glitter. Less effort was spent maintaining the Duke's image. More was spent on what sustained the land. Alaric still rode out through the main gate. He still attended gatherings where his name was required as a symbol. He was still called Your Grace everywhere. But the people who needed answers no longer came to him first. They asked, "Has Her Grace reviewed it? What does Her Grace prioritize? Does Her Grace have notes?" His title remained. The substance inside it had been emptied. In early spring news came that Seraphina was with child. The manor fell into a different sort of silence. No one dared label it joy the way they once might have, because the meaning of heirs had shifted. This child was not proof of Alaric's lasting power. It was proof that Seraphina's future would continue whether or not the old story of the Duke remained intact. The labor began on a night of gentle rain. Whitaker summoned the midwife with quiet precision. Clara stayed outside the chamber door through the long hours, refusing to sit. Thornfield ordered the morning's paperwork halted without being asked, as if the household itself understood what now mattered. They moved around Seraphina's door with the rule they had learned from her: no panic, no performance, only necessary action. The child arrived just before dawn. A boy healthy, strong, bearing the name Vale by blood and law. When the midwife placed him into Seraphina's arms, she murmured softly, "He has bright eyes, my lady." Seraphina looked at her son for a long time, not with the gaze of a woman finally receiving what marriage had promised. With the gaze of someone who understood the deeper truth: this child would grow up in a house where power was no longer a man's voice in the center of a hall. He would grow under an order built by competence, not charm. Alaric appeared not long after. He stood at the foot of the bed looking at the child in Seraphina's arms. He did not speak much. The old confidence had nowhere to stand in this room. Finally, he asked, voice nearly unsteady, "Is he?" "Well, he's well," Seraphina answered. Then she did not immediately hand the child to him. The delay was brief, no more than a heartbeat. But it said everything. The blood might carry his name. The future would not be written by his illusion. Weeks later, when Seraphina had regained her strength, she carried her son to the eastern window of Vale House. Early spring was still cold. Mist lay thin over distant fields. Roads cut faint lines through the land routes of supply and movement that now ran in the rhythm she had shaped. From the window she could see the central granary roofs, the long shed of transport wagons. The river line opened again. The counties that had once been near breaking now held steady under a new system. Her son slept against her breath, small and even warm. There was no counsel in the room, no chandelier, no applause given to the wrong name, no audience, only the truth in its clearest form. She had stayed. She had looked directly at the machine that had ground her into invisibility, and she had turned it quietly, steadily, until it moved in a different direction. Not by running, not by destroying, only by refusing to kneel to a story that no longer deserved her. She pressed her lips to her son's forehead, looked out over the Vale lands under pale morning light, and spoke so softly it felt like she was speaking to the child, the earth, and herself all at once. This time, everything begins with me. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. It means more than you know. If Seraphina's journey resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments and share your perspective. A like and a quiet subscribe help keep stories like this alive for others who need them. And if you're drawn to tales where the quiet ones rise and rewrite their fate, there are many more waiting for you here.